Welcome to your Essential Business Briefing. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up, India's employment dilemma. As the economy bounces back from the pandemic slump, we're asking why job creation isn't keeping up. Can price controls really help to reduce inflation? We'll look at the experience in Argentina. Plus, shifting gears in the motor industry as dealerships adapt to drivers' changing preferences. India's finance minister will present the country's 2022 budget on Tuesday. It's coming at a crucial time for the economic recovery there. The International Monetary Fund has upgraded its growth forecast to 8.7% for India for 2022, but unemployment spiked in December to just under 8%, according to research from the Centre for Monitoring the Indian Economy. That's the highest rate in 4 months. The employment situation in India is worrying some economists, and not just because of the pandemic. Let's speak now to Rajat Kathuria, who's Professor of Economics and Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Shiv Nadar University in Delhi. Rajat, thanks very much for being with us. We're seeing growth return to the Indian economy, and it's picking up as well, according to the latest IMF report. Why aren't we seeing the jobs market following in the same direction?
I think this is a problem which has sort of come to the fore as a result of the pandemic. The jobs market was never sort of growing commensurately with the growth. The elasticity of jobs with respect to growth or with respect to the GDP was always low for India for a number of reasons, including labor laws. And I think what the pandemic has done, it's exaggerated this fragility or weakness in the market. So while growth is happening, jobs are not picking up. There are a lot of people who are getting disheartened and moving out of the labor force, with the result that the numbers you see are high, but I guess they should be higher, given that the inequality has risen. At the lower end of the pyramid, at the lower end of the income bracket, jobs are not growing, are stagnant, and people are falling out of the labor force. So it is worrying. And I think this was a worry even before the pandemic, and the pandemic has made a bad situation increasingly worse. Yeah.
Let's talk about solutions then. What, first of all, can the government do to help create those jobs that are needed to make more formal employment in the manufacturing sector?
I think the government needs to do something very basic, which we've been talking about in India for a long period of time, which is increase and improve the quality of infrastructure, the public goods necessary to crowd in private investment. Once that happens, investment in manufacturing and labor-intensive manufacturing would pick up. So the government doesn't have to do anything special. We know that the government by itself cannot create the jobs that India needs. So it will have to create an environment, an enabling environment for the manufacturing sector, labor-intensive manufacturing sector in specific, so that private sector can come in and invest and create those labor-intensive jobs. There are examples of special economic zones. There are examples of national economic manufacturing zones and coastal economic zones, which have been tried. But I think more power on implementation by the government, more force by the government on implementation, and of course on investment and crowding in on private investment is the route for us to go to create more formal jobs in the manufacturing sector.
And does the private sector have a role to play? Do they just need to get the investment in there? And how does the private sector react to that?
So private sector will do what it's due. And it's been sort of accused of being too much after profits and profit maximization and shareholder wealth. So I think the role for the private sector is recognize the reality of India, recognize the labor market realities of India, not to eschew profit maximization completely, but don't keep it as the topmost priority. Keep, employment promotion as the topmost priority in India, especially when you see that the labor market, the unemployment rates are at historical highs. The employment as a proportion of population today is about 36%. And it's lower than the pre-pandemic levels of 39%. And that's as a proportion of the population. And the private sector should recognize that and try and maximize employment as much as possible. And the other thing I would sort of advocate for the private sector is that invest in India and get more investments into India rather than investing abroad. There's a history of capital flight, not too much, at the margins perhaps. Even those investments can perhaps be brought into India. And of course, they keep complaining about lack of facilitation, lack of a lot of protectionism, etc. That's for the government to do, and we should continue to advocate to the government to enable the environment for manufacturing. But private sector must play its part as well. There's no point And there's no point in continuously sort of complaining about the government and about the environment. The government will do what it has to do, and so must the private sector.
These are big changes that need to happen. How quickly do you think a situation can see dramatic improvement, particularly when it comes to getting more people into the labour force and boosting that participation rate?
I think it will be a slow process, but the history of reforms and liberalization in India, Stephen, has always been on the back of a crisis. And today we face a labor market crisis, and every crisis, as the cliche goes, is an opportunity. So it will take time, but the signals have to be given now that the government is in the mood for making these big ticket changes and encouraging investment. I think the general elections are still about 2.5 years away. So this is a good time to sort of deepen the reforms that we had started in 1991. And it is a time, if not for big bang, at least an incremental set of reforms that would make it easier to invest in the private sector, that will make it easier for people from the labor market to find productive employment. And for its part, the government needs to also focus on health and education, two of the major weaknesses in our economy that the pandemic has brought to the fore. So the healthcare system and the education infrastructure, especially the public education infrastructure at the primary level, needs to be given a boost.
Okay, Rajat Kathuria, thank you very much from Shiv Nadar University in Delhi. Now, inflation is making headlines in many parts of the world, with prices rising at their fastest pace in decades in the United States and Europe. But those rates of 5 or 7% pale in comparison to Argentina, where a central bank survey is predicting inflation of almost 55% this year. That's despite steps being taken by the government there to control prices. Kate Moody's been looking into this. Kate, first of all, remind us, why is inflation in Argentina so high?
Well, it's been a long-standing problem for the country. The 1980s were a period of hyperinflation. Prices rose a whopping 3,000% in 1989. Double-digit inflation has become the norm over the last 2 decades or so. A series of policy blunders, including a major debt default in 2001, saw the value of the peso plunge, driving up the cost of imports and making borrowing on the international markets difficult. The central bank has printed more and more money to finance government spending, further fueling inflation. More recently, the country has faced the same pandemic-related pressures as other economies, including pent-up consumer demand, and that helped push the 12-month average in December to over 50%.
One of the ways the Argentinian government has tried to control this issue is with price controls. Is it working?
Not really. This is another one of those strategies that's been rolled out repeatedly over the last few decades in Argentina. But every time the controls are lifted, prices surge again. The current government has a program that caps the prices of certain goods. It was extended to over 1,000 products in October, but inflation is still rising. Artificially holding down prices may temporarily ease pressure on consumers, but it does little to break the long-term inflation trend. The American Chamber of Commerce in Argentina has described this latest round of price controls as a ticking time bomb.
Do price controls ever work when it comes to controlling inflation?
The overwhelming majority of economists say no. Repeated attempts to control consumer goods prices, as we've seen in Argentina, can undermine investor confidence in an economy. If businesses have to absorb higher costs, they may reduce hiring or stop producing. That can lead to shortages or push consumers to the black market. Very targeted measures to prevent price gouging in a specific situation can make sense, like freezing the price of hand sanitizer at the start of the pandemic, but they tend not to be effective in the longer term. In Argentina, most experts argue the inflation cycle won't be broken without much broader reforms.
Okay, Kate Moody, thank you. Well, here in France, sales of new cars still haven't recovered since the pandemic. The number of new vehicles registered last year was down by a quarter compared to 2019. Problems like supply shortages and changing demand for transport have also pushed car dealerships to make changes in what they sell. Solange Mougin reports.
For this car dealership, the future is electric vehicles of all sorts.
Il y a de la trottinette, il y a du vélo, il y a du scooter. Après, il y a en 3 roues, il y a notre production maison qui est le frigone.
The shift towards selling more electric vehicles had become a necessity for this dealership after a continued drop in sales. In France, 25% fewer cars were sold last year compared to pre-pandemic numbers.
Les showrooms étaient fermés aussi pendant le Covid. Après, on a eu la pénurie, donc ça fait quand même 2-3 ans assez compliqué pour la vente de véhicules neufs. Les gens veulent se déplacer différemment.
Electric car sales jumped by 45% in France last year, but they still make up only a sliver of purchases at under 10%. With buyers becoming increasingly conscious of their carbon footprint and a supply of new cars hit by a shortage of microchips, the used car sector is booming. At this refurbisher, over 1,000 pre-owned cars are waiting to be fixed and spruced up.
On va contrôler toute la partie carrosserie, s'il y a des plastiques qui sont enfoncés, cassés, rayés.
The company makes between 500 and 1,000 euros per vehicle, and sales are booming. They plan to open 4 more centers.
L'avantage d'avoir la segmentation par type d'activité, on va forcément gagner en temps de réparation, puisque là, tout le collaborateur va avoir l'intégralité des outils, en tout cas, qui sont directement sur place.
Used car sales broke records last year in France with 6 million purchases. But such demand has affected sticker prices. They went up 13% in 2021.
That's all from us for now, but you'll find this and all of our previous programmes available to watch on our website and available as a podcast wherever you usually listen. And we're on social media for your comments and questions. Until next time, thanks for watching.
Join us in Germany for our latest edition of Europe Now, a country at a political turning point as its Chancellor of 16 years, Angela Merkel, bows out, giving way to a three-way coalition that's never been tried before. The Social Democrats, Greens and Liberals coming to power, promising big things, particularly more drastic action on climate change, a major priority in this region of West Germany, which suffered devastating deadly floods in the summer of 2021. Join us in Germany on Europe Now as we explore those and other big issues for this country in the years to come.